Welcome, everyone. And welcome especially to our esteemed panelists. This is a great room. I love the standing crowd. So we're going to have a real debate here, and I just want to introduce our panelists to you. We've got some incredible world leaders here from different corners of the world. Sitting directly next to me is Joachim Nagel. He is the president of the Bundesbank. We have the managing director, of course, of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, our host today. We have the prime minister from Poland, Prime Minister Morawiecki. And we have Nadia Feta, the Minister of Finance from Morocco, and Raghu Rajan, who is from the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. And before I start, I just want to take a moment to say on this stage that as a journalist, I'm very lucky for this opportunity to moderate a free and fair debate. And my thoughts today are with Evan Gershkowitz, who should also have the opportunity to do his job and ask the tough questions. And I join many others here at the IMF and in this room, calling for his immediate release. So with that, we're here to debate the global economy. So let's get right into it. Managing Director, you set the tone this week, and it was kind of a downbeat tone on your outlook for the global economy. Why are you so worried?
So let me start asking you a question. If the growth is slowing down, but inflation is not, shouldn't we be thinking of more vigilance? Our answer from the IMF is the following. We have been remarkably resilient. The world economy has gone from one shock to another, and yet our fears of depression in 2020, our fears of recession last year have not materialized because of the decisive actions policymakers have taken. But we are experiencing a slow growth that we expect to remain slow for quite some time. This year, growth is going from 3.4 in 22 to 2.8%. And when we look into the next 5 years, it would be averaging around 3%. This is simply not enough to provide people and businesses the opportunities they seek. Second, inflation has proven to be stickier than anybody thought it would be. It is fantastic that central bankers have acted decisively. We have one of them here. Give Mr. Nagel a big round of applause. Keep this inflation going down.
Are we applauding?
They have been successful. They have been successful. We see inflation trimming down, but we expect core inflation to be still too high all the way through this year into the next. So in that context, our analysis at the IMF is that we need to concentrate on three things. One, price stability and financial stability. Two, have a foundation for growth. Two, concentrate on productivity. Unless we get productivity to go up, we are not going to see growth going up. And three, there are things we are doing that are harmful. Fragmentation in the world economy is a drag on growth.
We're going to get into specific policies, but just in terms of setting the stage on the outlook, Prime Minister, you're here. A big part of what's holding us back is this war in Ukraine. We've all followed in awe your response and your contributions, both militarily, from a humanitarian point of view, the transit that you've provided. What has it done for your economy and your outlook?
Well, to address the major challenges of the nowadays, which is slowdown, as Kristalina just said, and not appropriate level of growth, we have to look for addressing root causes. Mm-hmm. And the war in Ukraine is one of the root causes, and this is why I wish that Ukraine very quickly wins this war, because one of the basic root causes would be eliminated, would be out of picture. And the ripple effects already are happening, and one of them was energy crisis, which so badly hit the whole of Europe, including Poland. But we were a little bit smarter than the others this time in the history, because we have built a number of new interconnectors and gas pipeline system to Norway. And thanks to this, for the first time in our history, we are independent of Russian fossil fuels. We are not importing gas, we are not importing oil. And now the inflationary pressures for the first time in 12, 13 months are weaker, which is a good sign of an economy recovering from those very dire situations. And the other aspect, which is of global nature as well, is related to pandemic and re-establishing, recreating of global value chains, if I may say so. And here again, Poland and Central and Eastern European countries are gonna benefit from this, because there's lots of reshoring, friendshoring, nearshoring, rather than outsourcing and offshoring of different functions. This is why one of the biggest sectors in the Polish economy is business process outsourcing and shared services centers, which is very good for re-establishing those fragmented, yet again, fragmented value chain links. And I think it'd be good for Europe if we realize what are the real challenges of the nowadays, apart from war, re-establishing the production chains on a different footing than it used to be. They used to be before the pandemic. And the third, last but not least aspect, is to come to terms with all the aggressive forces around us, which create this noise, and which do not allow all the states, all peace-loving states, to normally develop, because they try to, create different circumstances for them to be able to flourish in this noisy environment. So to say, I try to be diplomatic, but that's a huge challenge on the global scene.
Nadia, all of the economic relationships, many of them have been, as the Prime Minister referenced, redefined as a result of the war in Ukraine. Our friends closer, we learn who our friends are. You know, how does it impact a country like Morocco, who is very reliant on Russia, right, for grains, and China, but also an ally of the West? How has it impacted your economy and your economic relationships?
We live in the same world, and we have 3 years of really uncertainty, shocked, and we definitely suffering from, I would say, other countries' internal problems or global problems. Morocco has a motto for years to be an open country, to push for international cooperation, and today I'm seizing this opportunity to say that we cannot, I would say, keep with this double standard. We should abolish it, because countries like Morocco would suffer from this, I would say, fragmentation, from the increase of crisis. But we have chosen to work with all the countries to diversify our economy. So this fragmentation can really be a risk for economies of Africa, of emerging markets that are the engine of the growth. But today we have to push for, I would say, avoid this fragmentation. Let me give 1 or 2 examples. In Morocco, we are suffering from a brain drain. We say you have to invest in your talent, in human capital. If a 22 years engineer wants a visa, he will get it from 10 years. If a small SME the heart of our economy, want to travel to get raw material, to get engine, to get something, it will take them 6 months to get the job. So we need to do our part of the job to be resilient to the economy, but I think the engine of the economy in emerging markets, and we cannot, the global world cannot afford to stop them in investing in their future.
Trade is an issue. So President Nagel, we talked about Europe and the energy problems of Ukraine, and Kristalina used the word resilient. When I think of Europe, it has been remarkably resilient, given some of the concerns about energy, especially an economy like Germany. How are you feeling about the outlook at this point?
Before I answer your question, first let me say thank you to Kristalina for your kind words regarding the performance of the central banks over the last
But you're not done, right?
Yeah, 12 months. But let me just mention, I would like to take that opportunity also to thank you personally and the IMF for your excellent crisis management over the last 15 months. So also an applause for the IMF. So now coming back to your question, I think, as Kristalina said, this fight is not over. I think it's still some way we have to cover, and we have to really look what the inflation outlook might be over the rest of the year. It seems that the headline inflation is coming down. This is good news, but core inflation is still pretty high. I'm a little bit more positive here, and this is something when something from the Bundesbank is saying that the inflation outlook is maybe a little bit brighter. I believe that core inflation also for the Eurosystem might come down before the summer break. But if core is close to 6%, I guess there is something, and this is self-explaining, so that we have to do our job. This is our primary objective. We have to bring inflation down, and at the end we will succeed. Coming to your question regarding how is Europe doing, I think we shouldn't forget where we started 15 months ago. We were in a deep crisis. This horrible war affected the whole world, Europe on the energy side. I think the energy question more or less is solved. It's not complete over, but it seems to be that we find solution how to deal with that. It's maybe not perfect, but I think it's something we can deal with that. I think the adaptation capacity, especially of the German industry, is also very good. So also we are here a little bit more positive than the IMF. I think taking the whole Eurosystem, the European Union, taking Germany, the first quarter seems to be pretty weak, but the rest of the year seems to be much better. So it is not over, so the crisis management is not done, but I guess there are some good signs that we can more or less manage this.
You think you can kill inflation without inducing recession in Europe?
I do not see that there is a recession coming. It seems to be that there is more or less a mild landing. All what I see is that, yes, there's maybe a weak first quarter, but the rest of the year seems to be rather favorable. So I believe that we learned some lessons from the past rate cycles, but I think two buzzwords I learned over the last 2 days is not being complacent. This is right. I guess the last 5 weeks learned a lesson on its own, and I guess we discussed this later. And being vigilant, you already said this. I think if we are not being complacent, being vigilant, then I'm rather optimistic.
Raghu, what about for the U.S.?
Well, let me rain on the love fest that's going on here. I mean, policymakers have been certainly faced with enormous challenges. But if you look back at policies, you have to say that some of what we're experiencing now is a result of some of those policies. I mean, inflation, well, the fiscal in the US was pretty, extravagant. And if you look at some of what's happening to the banks, some of that is a result of the extreme increase in quantitative easing, which flooded the banks with money, and then they put it in the wrong places. That was banking, but of course they had a lot of money to deal with. And so you cannot completely dissociate some of the problems, inflation, the financial sector problems, from the response. Now, of course, hindsight is 20/20, and I don't want to second guess, policymakers at that time. I think going forward, I think the biggest issue that the US can do to contribute to global development is what the finance minister talked about, which is, can we limit the extent to which fragmentation happens to the purely strategic and keep the rest out of it? How can we separate these two issues? Because what is happening now is, first, there's very little dialogue between the two big powers. And second, what we're seeing is fragmentation, or security becomes the front for protectionism of all kinds, which, as you know, can get very, very deep. And as the finance minister said, we need the scope for exports of goods, but also of services, as the Prime Minister said, in order to have a strong, stable world. If those get shut off, you get a much more volatile world, because each economy trying to grow on its own is going to find it much harder, and of course that creates political problems domestically.
But is that realistic in the US at a time where neither party really is embracing globalization and free trade?
Yeah, it comes back to haunt you, right? This is where you need leadership. Where is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? I think the most immediate way developed countries will experience the consequences from the rest of the world is migration. You will see large amounts of migration if countries cannot get their act together outside the developed world.
Yeah, no, I was referring to the US, but I guess, Madam MD, this is a problem. You know, we did an interview this morning and talked about the rising tensions between the US and China. A few people mentioned here friendshoring and nearshoring, and just some of these structural factors that seem to be leading to fragmentation, the word of the meeting.
Well, the question we need to ask is what we have learned from the last years about security of supply. What we learned is that we are in a more shock-prone world, and we cannot anymore make allocation decisions only based on cost. We have to have certainty, and it is based on diversifying and also thinking through the logic of how we build these supply chains. We also learned that the long period of time when we would praise globalization because it did bring fabulous benefits, we did not honestly talk about those who lost their jobs, lost opportunities as a result of globalization, and what should be done about them. So in my view, we are at the point when we have to have a very robust discussion of the future to respect security also related to national security. The horror of Russia's war in Ukraine is mostly felt by the Ukrainian people, but it is felt actually by all of us in this room, everybody, everywhere, because no more we can take peace for granted. And the implication of it is that we lost the peace dividend of the last decades. And we have now a situation in which, Raghu, regrettably, there would be more thinking around backing your economy against geopolitical risks, not only economic risks. This is reality. But it need not be a reality in which we willy-nilly throw the baby with the bathwater. As Raghu was saying, we have to think how we can have a rational platform that allows cooperation to continue. We, the IMF, are a part of this platform, and I do believe that we have a role to keep countries together so they can compare notes on economic policy, even if they are in a different place on some of the issues. And then we have to relentlessly pursue building bridges and tunnels that allow the world economy to remain integrated, because if we fail, the cost on ordinary people is going to be enormous. We have run analysis at the IMF, and it says that trade disintegration can cost us 0.2 all the way to 7% of global GDP. It is like taking Germany and Japan and wiping them out from the economic map. So it is not trivial whether it is 0.2% or it is 7%. If you add technological fragmentation, it can go to 12%. You add financial flow disruptions, it goes higher. So who in this audience wants to be poor? Anybody raising a hand? So, I mean, let's roll our sleeves, do the hard work as policy makers to have rational decisions that enhance security and protect prosperity.
So we were supposed to have a sixth panelist here on stage. Mo Ibrahim was supposed to be here. Of course, billionaire, he had travel issues and sent us a note of what he would say. And he would interject at this point, I think. And he's doing a lot of work, for those who don't know, on African governance. And he's critical of the IMF and other multilateral institutions and says there's not enough representation from the poorest countries that they are intended to help serve. And yes, he understands that companies have shareholders, but they also have board members. And that the priorities and the focus don't necessarily align with some of the key members, like the African countries. And I'm wondering, maybe, Nadia, I'll turn it to you first, and whether you agree with that, and whether there are useful reforms that can be made in advance of you hosting the annual meetings in the fall.
There is always more, I would say, there is always a room for more collaboration, especially for the African continent, African countries with IMF. I will give a clear testimony of Morocco. We've been having a very good cooperation with IMF for years and difficulties for the last 3 years. Like any policymakers, challenge, because we need to mitigate the impact of the crisis, but we pledged that we will be back to macroeconomic fundamentals, and we pledged also to the Moroccan population that we'll be doing the necessary reform for a social state. So, problem, how to fund for this? A plan, tough discussion with IMF, disciplined discussion with IMF, and a great achievement, which is the precautionary line, the FCL. First time that an African country gets to this precautionary line. What does it mean? It means that we, in total responsibility, said that we want to manage the crisis on our way with autonomy, but the shocks are there, external shocks are there, so we need insurance for the future, not to stop any of the reforms. I know, unfortunately, that not all the African countries can afford this. They have other challenges, but we like to see our story maybe as an example, and happy to share it, so I cannot not thank the IMF, the MD, and all the team for the trust, but also for this, I would say, for being demanding on what Morocco is trying to do and committed to do in the future. So this is a testimony, very recent testimony, and I wanted to share it.
President Nagel, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, maybe let me make this very general point. I think this adequate representation within the IMF, this is not a new question. I think this is a question we have over the years, for decades. I think you're used to that, and I'm having a lot of trust in your work to find a way how to deal with that question. The more important issue here is, what is the IMF doing for the most vulnerable countries? Yes. And what I learned over the past 50 months since I'm in this role is that you develop new programs, you have a lot of efforts to tackle these really complicated questions. This is more important to me than the quota discussion.
So, may I?
Yeah, you may.
Okay.
We're talking about you. So.
Well, of course, Mo has a point. Institutions have to strive to evolve with times and even stay ahead of times. I take pride that at the IMF, over the last years, we have focused relentlessly on the most vulnerable members we have. We have provided highest in our history lending. We just hit the record 2 weeks ago. And it goes to 96 countries. 50 of these countries are low-income countries. We have shaped the lending to fit different needs. We have about 140 billion in precautionary arrangements, like for Morocco. Why is this important? Much better to put a cushion under the feet before a crisis hits than to have to come and rescue a country after the crisis has already exploded. And secondly, we have provided vulnerable middle-income countries with vital support, about 120 billion. Among them is Ukraine. And I want to say that Ukraine has earned unique support from the IMF because of the uniqueness of how strongly they own their economy and manage it well. And we have provided $39 billion of lending through emergency financing. So I wish Mo was here. I can then tell him, look him in the eye and say, Mo, this is not your grandmother's IMF. But do we have to do more? Yes, we are now striving to mobilize the 100 billion of on-lending of SDRs that have been committed. We are moving up with Japan just doubling their contribution from 20% to 40% of their own SDRs. We are going to get more concessional finance for our low-income members because what I fear is this dangerous divergence that is taking place in front of our eyes, with the most vulnerable countries falling further behind. Terrible for their people, but also terrible for stability and security in the world. Big potential source of migration that can destabilize countries.
No, Raghu, did you want to?
Yeah, I just
then I want to
want
move into some other policy.
Say it's not just about representation. I think that's an issue, but it's also about the frameworks. The frameworks, for example, for debt restructuring and renegotiation. And the sense that some of the important players today feel is they weren't part of the initial framework discussion. And they're now subject to a framework which they had no part in designing and which is biased towards certain countries. And that's creating a huge problem. And my sense is, at some point, we've got to discuss all this again. It's been so many years since Bretton Woods. We have developed a lot of structures. Those structures have a history. We have to revisit some of those structures again to see whether they fulfill the needs of the moment. And we're seeing the consequences. Countries cannot get debt relief, even though they're in desperate situations. And we have to try and see, are there ways we can sort of deal with that problem? And one is to bring people on the table. The other is new innovative thinking. I think the IMF has done this with these flexible programs. But for example, for corporations, there's a debtor in possession financing, which happens when the company really needs to continue, but it can declare bankruptcy. Can we think of something like that for countries so that they get the money when people are starving?
Yeah.
Sri Lanka shouldn't have happened. Sri Lanka, they couldn't get petroleum. That kind of situation can we avoid?
So big development on that front, Raghu. Just yesterday, we had a meeting of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable. First time, we are bringing around the table traditional creditors, new creditors, private sector, public sector, and the debtor countries. And that is exactly how you get to a new framework in which everybody has a voice, everybody is included, decisions can be made.
Prime Minister, you had are we going to do Bretton Woods too in Poland?
Building on a couple of points which were made, I'd like to make a couple of reflections on those as well. First, I would like to have one big thank to Kristalina and to IMF for support of Ukraine, because one of the plans of President Putin was to make Ukraine completely bankrupt, not able to pay their nurses, doctors, teachers, soldiers, policemen, and so on. And the European Union, the United States, and IMF, these are the three bodies which collectively helped Ukraine and are helping Ukraine months after months to collect money to support their society. That's on a very positive front. Thank you, Kristalina. If I were to make one big advice to the IMF, I would say focus more on tax havens. Because tax havens are these places in the world where very rich people and very rich companies are hiding their capital, their money, and this money is not invested, therefore, in Morocco, in Poland, in Sri Lanka, in India, and elsewhere, and the rich get even richer, poor get poorer. That's not sustainable model for the future. My comment number 3 is more about the macroeconomic model or modus operandi of Western Europe, and I hope my friend from the right forgive me a couple of comments on this model. Like, the model was following: having very cheap energy from Russia, having very cheap labor force from Morocco, brain drain, from Poland, brain drain from other countries, having very cheap capital, cost of capital, thanks to Bundesbank and now European Central Bank. Then having security for free from America, because Germany and the other partnering countries are not spending enough money on military equipment, defense expenditures, and so on. And the last pillar of this model was selling high-margin products to China. So now we can see that all those 5 pillars are not in a very good shape, to say the least. And probably our Western European friends will have to reinvent their macroeconomic stroke operational model altogether. Because the energy is not going to be for free any longer because of war in Ukraine. The security provided for the last 70 years for free from America is not going to be as cheap as it used to be for 70 years. Poland and the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe are richer and richer, and we are no longer the source of the main source of the brain drain and the source for cheap labor force. For the first time in our history, last 300-400 years, for the first time, last 3 years, there were many more people coming to Poland than migrating out of Poland for work or anything. And I'm not counting Ukrainian refugees, I'm saying Poles who went abroad and now are coming back. So we have to be honest to ourselves. We are living in the time of a huge revamp and rethinking and establishing of not only production chains, value chains, but also operational models of many countries. And one additional example, which my 2 friends, my minister from Morocco, provoked me mentioning as well, apart from brain drain, which is an excellent comment. Rich countries are exploring poorer countries through brain drain in particular. This is happening all the time. We have to stop it, but that was said. The last comment maybe about the European Union. In the Treaty of Rome, there were 4 major freedoms. Freedom to provide services, goods, freedom of movement of people, and capital. And 3 of them, goods, capital, and people, are pretty much well established within the European Union. They serve well the richer countries and freedom to provide goods serve well also Central and Eastern European countries, the recently coming countries coming to the European Union. The last one, the freedom to provide services, is not at all functioning, or it's functioning very, very poorly. Why? Because this could be a very good way to equalize chances for Morocco, not in the European Union, but that by and large it goes also for partnering countries, surrounding countries, for Poland and for other countries surrounding European Union, to increase the competitiveness of the whole of the European Union, rather than to close the markets through special directives in fear of services companies coming from Central and Eastern Europe. Different service companies, construction, IT, consulting, consultancy, and so on. So here you have a pot of gold not utilized appropriately, because rich countries want to actually preserve their richness and not to allow the others to cooperate on many other fronts, and not only in those areas which are of benefit to the rich countries. That's my internal European Union debate, which I have every now and again on the European Council level. And I can tell you, well, the understanding of this is getting very slowly, very slowly.
So I just want to, in the time that we have left, there are a few important questions that we need to tackle here in the global outlook. For instance, Raghu, you mentioned the banks. I think, President Nagel, we need to find out from you whether you think that the bank failures in the U.S. and the rushed merger with Credit Suisse, acquisition, is calm? Are things calm, or is there going to be more banking contagion, and is it going to be global?
So, as I said, I think complacency is not the right way to more or less qualify what's happened over the last 5 weeks. But to say this very precisely, this is definitely not a new financial crisis. It's different from 2008.
I got corrected on that this morning. Managing director.
So this is absolutely for sure. I think these are more or less, they are idiosyncratic risks, cases, this is for sure, but we should also ask ourselves, is our regulatory framework the right one to tackle maybe the challenges of the future? And so this was a stress test for our system. And maybe we have to stress ourselves a little bit further. We should do our penetration test for our framework, how to deal with these new challenges. And there are still some blind spots that are not covered. And so, yes, the banks are more resilient, better capitalized, liquidity situation is better, but there is still some vulnerabilities of the banking system. And this is something we should take into account. So we should have this lesson learned out of that. That would be the right conclusion, and ask ourselves, what should we do to make the system even more robust, more stable? But let me say the final point. A full implementation of Basel III would have been the best first line of defense. And we are still lagging behind here. And though this is my point here, we should do that as soon as possible.
Maybe I'll ask it another way. Is Deutsche Bank going to be okay?
This is one of the questions central bank would never answer, not answer any specific question on a bank, but I can say the German banking system is very robust. And you mentioned one bank, this is the largest one.
Raghu, is the American banking system going to be okay?
It's hard to say, right? Because the fragilities are not just idiosyncratic. Two things are different from the global crisis. One, that there's an enormous increase in demandable uninsured deposits in the banking system over the last couple of years, and that's a consequence of QE. Second, interest rates have gone up significantly.
Yeah.
They didn't go up in the global financial crisis.
Yep.
Both those things create vulnerabilities in the system. We can't as the president said, be complacent right now, that it's over. It ain't over till it's over, which will be quite some time when we can feel confident. I just want to add one comment to what the Prime Minister said. Look, we need to find new areas of growth. And clearly the last bastion of protectionism, where we still have protected, is services. And that could be an enormous new area. And importantly, for industrial countries, it will reduce inequality, because protected services, especially high-paying services, is where the inequality is emerging. If you had more competition there, in medicine, for example, in consulting, in legal services, that would bring down inequality in those countries, but elevate global growth, as also growth in those countries. You could reduce political pressures. Of course, you've got to get past the first hurdle. How do you get the lawyers to unprotect their domain?
So we all need growth, and we learned that this audience, nobody wants to be poor. I'm curious, a show of hands, how many expect a global recession in the next year? Nobody?
No, there is one hand
One
over
person.
There.
One hand.
She deserves a picture.
So this is a good result, so we convince everyone.
So that means there's definitely going to be a global recession, right?
No, are we allowed to vote?
So can I say something,
Yeah.
Sarah? The most important lesson of the last couple of years, think of the unthinkable. We know that there would be some other shock coming from somewhere. We don't know from where, but we don't know when. So the answer to your question is, nobody can for sure vouch there won't be a recession or there will be a recession. But everybody in this room, I'm sure, is convinced that we have to build more resilience to these shocks at the level of the individual, the household, the businesses, the countries. And this is a very exciting agenda, because it may also be a growth-generating agenda.
So we have 1.5 minutes left. In the final time, I'm going to ask from each of you, very briefly, if you could, the global economy in 1 year, in 24, when we can all hopefully gather again in a lovely 80-degree day in Washington, D.C., the global economy will be fill in the blank. President Nagel.
I think ceteris paribus, and I try to be optimistic. I believe in 12 months we are in a much better shape compared to today.
Okay. My answer is I would take out the much. We will be in better shape than today.
Leaders are always optimistic.
Well, I am optimistic. I think that, a Polish economy will definitely be in much better position, but also I believe that the global economy, after those shocks, will find its way through, will maneuver between the rocks, and will find its way and will be in a much better position. But I believe that at the same time, those underlying issues will get accommodated, absorbed appropriately by the policymakers, and those longer-term challenges are going to be addressed as well.
I cannot afford not think that the 3 last year was the worst case scenario. So I am optimistic for the future. I think what policymakers have learned also is to be some or less humble and to, I would say, rethink their policy during the year. We couldn't do this earlier and go back to Parliament and said, we need to change, we need more money here, less money there. But today we cannot afford in this uncertain time. And this is what gives us hope that we will be able to be more resilient and probably more agile for future growth.
Raghu, you're the only one that's not a policymaker right now, so you can be fully honest.
I am always optimistic. We'll hopefully be recovering.
Recovered?
You said the world economy will hopefully be recovering.
Sarah, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Amen. Thank you all so much for taking the time, and thanks to our
Thank
great
you.
audience.